Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be around the world. My name is Andy Cutchins, and I'm a senior fellow here in Washington, D.C., uh, and running the Central Asia Connectivity Project, which was launched about 6 months ago. And this online event, looking at hydrocarbons, pipelines, transit corridors in Central Asia and in directions north, south, east, west, potentially, is part of that project. I will briefly introduce our discussants today. We have a terrific veteran group with so much knowledge about this. We'll first of all, Tatiana Mitrova, who is a research fellow at Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy, 25 years of experience with Russia, the former Soviet Union, global energy markets, has held important positions at SKOLKOVO in Moscow and also with the Russian Academy of Sciences. Secondly, we have Ed Chow, who has just flown in recently from Asia. Ed is a senior associate, well known in the Washington community, senior associate in energy security and climate change program at the Center for Strategic International Studies here in town. He has more than 4 decades of industry experience in this region, including 20 years with Chevron Corporation. And last and certainly not least, we have Greg Priddy, my colleague here at the Center for the National Interest. He's a senior fellow for the Middle East and energy. And Greg does a lot of consulting to corporations and financial clients on political risk and global energy markets, especially in the Middle East. And as many know him for his many years at the Eurasia Group. So let me turn the floor over to Tatiana, who will then be followed by Ed and by Greg to make some introductory remarks. Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andy, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. So, look, Central Asia is indeed a unique region, rich in hydrocarbons, but landlocked. It has, Kazakhstan has the largest proven oil reserves in the region. Turkmenistan has significant natural gas reserves, ranking fourth globally. Uzbekistan is also contributing to the region's gas production significantly. And the potential for additional supplies of hydrocarbons from Central Asia is really impressive. There are some announcements from Kazakhstan, from Turkmenistan about their ambitions on increasing this production, but there are some constraints. There are several challenges for the upstream development, which didn't start yesterday. I think you all remember in 1990s, there was this perception that Caspian might become like a second Gulf. It never did. And most of the projects in the region, they faced problems on the production side, both technological issues, first of all, because of very high sulfur content, which is leading to much faster corrosion of all the equipment, and difficult geology, deep horizons, high pressure. So it's not that easy to extract hydrocarbons there. But also there were lots of issues related to investment climate, regulation, access to the fields, taxation issues, and so on and so forth. So most of the projects, as I said, they faced delays and cost overruns. So these expectations, they had to be postponed and postponed, so they actually didn't materialize. And though there is quite a huge demand surrounding this region in China on the east, in Europe on the west, in India, Pakistan on the south, actually many projects, especially pipeline projects in the region, they are under discussion for decades. Nothing is happening. TAPI is probably one of the best examples. Trans-Caspian gas pipeline is another example. So if you add to that booming domestic demand, these countries inherited from Soviet time quite inefficient energy demand structure, really old and outdated energy infrastructure. So with the growth of population and GDP, their demand for energy, for subsidized, very cheap energy, is booming. And now, despite their richness in resources, they are basically all facing oil and gas deficit, which is really strange and odd, but that's the case. So they have to make very difficult choices between um, increasing supply for the domestic market at still low prices, thus incentivizing further energy demand growth, or restricting these supplies and ending up with a social unrest. Situation in Kazakhstan in the beginning of 2022, if you remember, it was incentivized by the increase of gas prices. So it can lead to really significant crisis domestically. Therefore, authorities are very cautious dealing with these issues. They prefer not to increase prices, not to incentivize energy efficiency. So demand is growing. Or another alternative for them is to actually give up their export obligations and end up with incredible fines, which they also don't want to do, or to increase imports of oil and gas from Russia, which is also problematic. So there are many sensitive issues, and it's both about getting potentially under sanctions and increasing the Russia's influence in the region, which they prefer to avoid. So the countries are really facing very difficult choices. And on top of that, as the time is running, actually, it seems that they start to lose the momentum. So with energy transition advances, the window of opportunity for the projects in the region is narrowing. And I assume that the next 2-3 years will be crucial, especially for gas, with substantial LNG volumes coming to the market already in 2026, 2027. EU, for example, may have resolved its current energy supply crisis and move further along with its energy transition path. And basically, it will be incredibly difficult to convince investors to fund any of these projects, so if the markets are not there. So it might become quite a sad story of unrealized potential. And if we keep in mind all the geopolitical clashes in the region, with all the great powers actually competing for the influence, the situation is becoming even more controversial. That's why this topic is indeed extremely interesting, fascinating to follow, but also very slow to bring any visible results. I think I'll stop on that. I've said already quite enough provoking things. So yeah, I will be happy to address the questions.
Thanks, Tatiana. That was a terrific start to the discussion. I mean, really illustrating the degree to which the situation regarding hydrocarbons and their development in the area has so dramatically changed over the last 20 years or so. I want to welcome our audience to the discussion, and please, we will have time later in the discussion for taking questions from the audience. So if you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to put your question or comment there, and we'll get to it as we can. Thank you very much. Ed, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Andy. I think I'll follow Tatiana's lead and just seed some issues to provoke the discussion among the panel and with the audience as we go. As it happens, I was in China towards the tail end of Mr. Putin's visit. Pure coincidence, I assure you. I planned my trip before he announced his, so I didn't know he was going to be there. But it was interesting talking to my old Chinese interlocutors. about their perception on the trip, which I might share. I think for them, for the Chinese, symbolically, this was an important visit for the following reasons. It was Putin's first trip, foreign trip after inauguration in this new presidential term. He came with a large delegation of important ministers and so on. So the Chinese viewed it as an important visit. It was interesting that they were interested in talking to me about what the external perception of that visit might be in the West. And I told them that the two leaders have met so many times in recent years, it's become rather commonplace. And maybe we don't see it as important as they do. We laughed about the fact that in this large delegation, the one person that was missing was Alexei Miller. And the Chinese brought this up to me. So, you know, Power of Siberia is the dog that still hasn't barked, in the proverbial Sherlock Holmes reference. The feasibility study was completed at the end of 2021 by Gazprom. Some of us expected that maybe when Mr. Putin arrived in Beijing early February of 2022, that there may be a signing ceremony. That didn't happen. And then the next 2 or 3 visits of the two leaders, there was no word on Power Siberia either. At the readout of the summit on the Russian side, there was mention that the two sides continue to work closely on the Power Siberia project. It's interesting that the Chinese readout didn't mention the project at all. So the impression I got, and they really said it, was that we're in no hurry on this project. Time's on our side. Some of us will recall that the Power of Siberia 1, I mean, I guess if you're going to call it 2, there should be a 1. Project took 10 years to negotiate. So it's pretty clear that the Chinese perception of the gas market is that they're not in any hurry to conclude the deal until they see the right price. So, I don't know how much longer, if 10 years is what it takes, and I don't know when the clock started, Tatiana, maybe you know, but we're either at the beginning of the journey or at best in the middle of the journey rather than anywhere close to the end of the journey. On Central Asia, I think Chinese got a late start on Central Asia oil and gas. What we should remember is that China did not become a net oil importer until 1992. Politically, they were caught somewhat by surprise by the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it really was not until the mid-1990s where the Chinese started investing time, money on Central Asian oil and gas. By then, a lot of the crown jewels like Tengiz have already been picked up by Western oil companies that were there much earlier. But I would say since then, China's been on a long march in Central Asia, that they will continue to keep their eye on that ball. Interesting that Mr. Putin had hardly left Beijing and went to Northeast China for a third day before Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Dushanbe. And so you can see that China will continue to keep their eye on the ball. The creation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has worked out much better for the Chinese than they could have imagined, certainly than I could have imagined at the time. I thought it was going to be kind of a silly talk shop, but it has turned out to be, allowing Chinese economic penetration of Central Asia with Russian political cover, I would say. But that's the way the Chinese would view it. Instead of Central Asia being a point of contention and competition between Russia and China, the SCO conveniently allowed China to do what it wants. On pipeline economics, I'll just make a few general remarks, and maybe you can delve into it more deeply. As Tatiana's already referenced, the problem with Central Asian oil and gas is not geology, but geography. You're a heck of a long way from market. In the oil industry, transportation is a cost center. It's not a profit center, except in highly developed markets like the United States. So someone has to finance these terribly expensive projects, and usually it requires producers to financially guarantee that they will use such a pipeline at a sufficient volume over a sufficiently long period of time to have a bankable project. Gas is even more difficult than oil for various reasons, but certainly including energy density and the value of the product that you are transporting across long distances. So these are not easy things to do from a commercial development standpoint. Now, governments are capable of subsidizing pipeline projects if they so choose. That's a different political decision that has to be made. And there are examples of that, but that's not a purely economic driver. China values diversity of supply routes. China is the largest oil importer in the world, more than 11 million barrels per day. Most of it comes by sea. So there is a value to having land-based pipeline access as well. But no one in their right mind thinks that Russian or Central Asian oil and gas imports can replace all of the Chinese imports coming by sea. 80% of Chinese oil imports today come by sea. So some balance is desirable, but it's a question of price and what the war in Ukraine has done is shifted the bargaining leverage from sellers of oil and gas to buyers of oil and gas, I would say, particularly for Russian product. So Russia needs to export its oil to farther away places like India and China, and that has shifted the leverage, and therefore I think China is in a relatively happy place in terms of balancing, trying to balance seaborne imports with land-based imports, and having Central Asia imports is important for leverage on bargaining with Russia on new projects as well. So with that, we'll stop. I think there are other things. I know that you want to talk about TAPI and Middle Corridor, and I have my views on those as well. But let me stop here.
I'm going to keep my remarks relatively brief. The countries that Andy had asked me to talk about, are to the south, and there are strong rationales for wanting to have pipeline connectivity to seaborne transportation, but also even more importantly to the growing demand center of India. And this is only more important now than it was back when they first started talking about TAPI in the 1990s. Because India has accelerated its economic growth and China has slowed in relative terms. So India is really becoming the big demand growth story globally. But despite the rationale for having connectivity across there, really nothing has moved. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I guess delve a little bit into the history of this and some of the other options as well. And one other point on the view from Central Asia is, for Turkmenistan in particular, they've had to deal with either Russia or China and have not had any alternatives to that. So that also was, having another export route that would give them a lot of leverage where they have faced monopsony buying power in the past. So, with the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, or TAPI as it's called, that was supposed to move 33 BCM per year, so kind of a medium volume. But it started back in the Taliban period. They've been talking about this literally since the mid-1990s during that period of Taliban rule. The initial version of it kind of got halted when the embassy bombings took place in '98 and the US fell out with the Taliban. And then ironically, when the US was backing an Afghan government and had a military presence there, the US again supported the idea, and that led to a framework agreement, MOU, that was signed by all four of those governments back in 2008, back when Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister of India. Now we're back to Taliban rule, and again, you have interest in it from the Taliban. What has really shifted now, though, there have always been reasons that this couldn't be done. But now, alongside the other reasons, India has pretty much shifted in the direction of disinterest. India, the current Indian government sees this as something that would not be adequately secure to even consider. They also have more, commercial questions about it. Despite the fact that, the largest argument for it is it's less than 1,200 miles from the Indian gas grid to Turkmenistan. This is not an exceptionally long pipeline, and the technical hurdles could definitely be overcome. But India has been increasing its LNG imports. That is a much more flexible source of supply and more secure, given your ability to source alternatives, as we saw with the reshuffling of the market when Europe had embargoed Russian gas. Pakistan has much larger gas needs than it did back in the 90s. But it also, so Pakistan is actually still interested in doing this even as a standalone without India's participation. And there have been a couple of MOU signings that have involved just Pakistan, Turkmenistan, and the Taliban weren't in on that MOU signing, but there have been MOU signings since then that have tried to keep the idea alive. And those three governments, including the Taliban now, have been discussing it. But Pakistan it doesn't have the financial heft and creditworthiness to be able to finance it. And so there's not a lot of interest among any companies that have the wherewithal to be able to do something on that scale. Moscow, interestingly enough, has backed the idea, and they see it as as possibly a way to strengthen their influence as well as get consulting or construction contracts. But it is, it's not something that's likely to move forward. A few other ideas that have been around in the past, I think the notion of Turkmenistan having a link across the Caspian that would link into Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Europe is pretty much, that has been talked about a lot, but that one is pretty much dead. I would say deader than the TAPI concept. There's not really interest on the Turkmen side anymore. There's a little bit of border trade in Turkmenistan and between Turkmenistan and Iran, but that has pretty low potential and doesn't, isn't something that would be expanded. The Turkmen exports to Iran into the Northeast, which is where Iran doesn't have the resource themselves. On the oil side, there was an interesting alternative. Back when we had pushed through the BTC pipeline, which was the US-backed route in the 90s, There was a competing route, through Iran, which ended up running aground on the Iran Sanctions Act back then. And that was something that the U.S. opposed strenuously. But it would have, it could have potentially been economic. More likely, though, in the future, and this is the one that could be revived, is a variant of that idea, which would be a swap deal. Most of Iran's oil demand is in the north, and you could conceivably have a swap deal where you have crude that comes in from the Caspian, goes into refineries in northern Iran, and frees up more Iranian crude for export. And that's something that wouldn't require a huge amount of new investment. So if the sanctions barriers to that were removed someday, that might eventually happen, or at least the economic argument for it is makes a good deal of sense. And with that, I'll wrap up and hand back over to Andy.
Thank you, Greg. Also an excellent overview. I have to say that we've received perspectives from the north, from the east, from the south, and to some extent from the west, and there doesn't seem to be adequate demand and financing to develop large new projects, be them fields or pipelines. And I get the impression that a lot of hydrocarbons may, with the clock ticking on energy transitions, that a lot of regional hydrocarbons may end up stranded in the ground. Is that a reasonable? Am I on target with that?
In some places, yes. And there's a lot of stranded gas out there around the world. And in Central Asia, it's not close to a coastline where it could be liquefied, and there are all these barriers to getting it out. So, the hurdles to that are quite high. And then there's the whole question of the energy transition, how fast. There clearly is growing gas demand in Asia, but Europe is on track to peak and start declining pretty soon. And that's the dilemma they had with, LNG replacing some of the lost Russian volumes, was they didn't want to commit to 30-year contracts because they don't want to do something that would question their ability to meet their climate goals. So that was one of the sticking points in those negotiations.
Tatiana, I see your hand up.
Yeah, Andy, the example of Uzbekistan, which used to be the largest gas producing country in the region and then became net gas importer, actually shows that domestic demand, it can absorb really huge volumes of hydrocarbons. And we didn't discuss energy transition in Central Asia, which is happening. There are some projects, there are a lot of documents and declarations, but there are also some projects on the ground, but still very, very limited. The energy balances of these countries in the region, they are primarily dependent on coal, gas, and oil. So for quite a long time, hydrocarbons will be needed domestically, even if we assume that there is no external demand. They will be fueling national economies. And basically, it's another question how to support them in order to start at least coal to gas switching, which is not there at the extent needed to deal with the climate threat. But also, quite speculative suggestion. But if we assume that this geopolitical shift that we are observing right now, with this like Cold War style confrontation between Russia and the West, if it goes further, and if it becomes like confrontation between the West and the East. Yeah, so we see already that China is getting this incredibly important role for Russia, for Iran. Yeah, so there is some new strange triangle evolving in Eurasia. And so then monetizing all these hydrocarbon resources, it can happen in a completely different way compared to everything that we were observing historically. You remember actually this gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to China, when it was discussed back in early 2000s, all the experts were saying it's crazy. It will never happen. It doesn't make any economic sense. It's like 9,000 kilometers or something like this. So it will never pay back. No, it's not bankable. Yeah. But when it comes to the Chinese state companies, yeah, they can handle such projects which wouldn't fly in the like traditional market economy. So if we are taking into account this big geopolitical game, and if China, for example, decides that it doesn't want to rely that much on the US LNG, and we can imagine such a scenario, yeah, actually all these resources of Russia and Central Asia and Iran are becoming much more important from the energy security, from the Chinese energy security point of view. So that may boost their development.
That's a great observation, Tatiana. How much U.S. LNG is going to China at this point, approximately?
It's
Go ahead, Tatiana.
It's comparable to the volumes of pipeline imports. So I wouldn't quote the numbers, but it is already quite big. It's US and Qatar LNG, first of all.
And
Ed, did you want to jump in?
it's an evolving situation because, you know, with the war in Ukraine, European gas prices went up. So a lot of the LNG that was originally destined for East Asia, not only to China, but also Japan, Korea, and so on, had been rerouted to Europe from the US. And that's partly because the Chinese economy has been weak during their COVID shutdown. With the Asian economies reviving now, particularly in China, I think we'll see a different picture by the end of this year compared to the last couple of years. So I expect the US LNG that has no destination clauses will start flowing more to the premium Northeast Asian market, which always have traditionally fetched a higher price than European gas.
Ed, I was wondering if you could talk about your perspective of the likelihood of the Power of Siberia Pipeline 2. It was 10 years ago in May, also when Putin visited, I think Shanghai actually, for 2 days, and the Chinese kept him waiting until the second day before they finally announced this $400 billion deal, which didn't really have any information about financing and important data. But nevertheless, and here we are 10 years later, and that the second deal still has not happened. Tatiana alluded to the shifting geostrategic, geopolitical environment. Did you get a sense when you were in China that that is having some impact on how the Chinese are thinking about maybe being a little more accommodating to Russia? It is very striking that Alexei Miller was not there, the head of Gazprom. He's had a pretty tough last 2 years, thanks to Vladimir's war in Ukraine, basically killing off 160 or so BCM at very good prices market in Europe. How do you pivot from that?
I wrote about the 2014 deal around the time, shortly after it happened. And one of the difficulties, and Tatiana alluded to this, is that when you have two state companies, in this case, Gazprom and CNPC, negotiating with their leaders weighing in, it's really hard to analyze what's in the deal. You don't even know what was on the table, besides gas. For example, coincidentally, at that Shanghai meeting, Putin was in Beijing first, didn't do a deal. The Western press was saying that there's going to be no deal coming, and then they pulled a rabbit out of a hat in Shanghai. But at the same time, the Chinese agreed to buy, I don't know, remember how many copies of S-400 systems. So, you just don't know what's in the deal. In retrospect, looking at Chinese import statistics and on the value of the Russian gas imports into China, it seems like the Chinese did a pretty good job negotiating that deal. You look at the landed price in China of the Russian gas compared to the landed price in Europe, China got a good deal. So I think their inclination would be to look for a similarly good deal. Now, what they mean by good deal, having been a commercial negotiator in my distant past, and having negotiated against both Russians and Chinese, by the way. I'd like to be a fly on the wall in the room, but I think there are various ways of getting to a deal that I would not discount. So I would not discount the possibility. Now, part of Gazprom's economics, this is surprising to me, and Tatiana can confirm or correct my information, was that their original calculation was to bring gas from Yamal. I mean, that's a heck of a long way to take gas through Mongolia to China. So maybe the gas sources that be a lot closer in Siberia. It seems to me it makes more sense for Yamal gas, other than LNG, to go to the demand centers in Western Russia and to swap the Siberian gas to China. So there are a lot of things, details that we won't ever know probably, but I don't discount that there will be a right deal. Whether that fetches Russia a handsome netback or not, that's a difficult question. But I think China thinks it. I mean, it's not just U.S. LNG, right? I mean, it's LNG from Qatar, with the big expansion coming, UAE LNG. So there are other LNG projects in the mix. So I think the Chinese are right to wait for the right deal. But does that mean that they will never sign a deal? I think that's a slightly different question.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple of, well, now 3 questions from the audience. I'll start with Margot Samajedny. Forgive me if I've mispronounced your name. It's concerning the middle corridor. What is your view on middle corridor connectivity potential due to current situation on Black Sea and limited maritime transportation? Greg, you talked a bit about the middle corridor and particularly making some pretty negative having a negative perspective on the prospects for a Trans-Caspian connector, which would be part of it. But you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I would break that up into the middle corridor as a broad concept that's not just energy, and the middle corridor is energy. And on the energy side, and specifically gas, I mean, everything I have seen about Turkmenistan recently suggests that there just is not really interest in going that way. They are still, they would like to have a third means of getting out, but they don't want, and I'm also not sure that in terms of bringing in foreign players to get that done, given that that would not be a Russia-friendly route, or neither Russia nor China would have an interest in getting that done. And Western IOCs, I don't think would have any interest at all, even if Turkmenistan wanted to do that. They're just not really in the business of going to the ends of the earth to the way that they were back in the 90s. So I think the Middle Corridor has promise when you think about other forms of transportation, but it's not really as a gas corridor that would be coming from that region.
Thanks. Tatiana, Ed, you want to?
I agree with Greg that the Middle Corridor is not about oil and gas specifically. For one thing, you basically bring oil and gas to another region with a lot of oil and gas. So what's the point? But it's really going to be about transporting goods, and this is where I think the conversation in Washington seems fanciful to me, because people talk about the Middle Corridor without involving China. And if you don't involve China, I don't know how you can possibly get the volume of goods necessary to finance the infrastructure investment needed. So, if the Middle Corridor is to succeed, it seems to me that China has to be in the picture and not out of the picture, as Washington seems to think that's possible.
Thanks. Tatiana?
Yeah, just one note. I agree that Middle Corridor is much broader than just hydrocarbon transportation. And I agree with Greg that chances for Trans-Caspian gas pipeline are not looking good at all. But I suppose Trans-Caspian oil transportation will increase. Simply because Kazakhstan, with the CPC dependency, 80% of Kazakh oil has to go through CPC and is actually completely dependent on Russia. So for them, and first of all, for the Western companies active in Kazakhstan, that's a problem. So they are looking for the diversification of their transportation routes. And connecting to the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline makes a lot of sense for them. And for oil, it's obviously much more easy than for gas. So I think this will expand. Another consideration to keep in mind, it is the recent discussion which started back in 2022. It's about North-South corridor. As something that Russia is trying to develop together with Iran, going through Azerbaijan or through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So far, it looks like a paper tiger, but as the ties between these countries, I mean Russia and Iran, are increasing, everything could happen. And again, it will depend on the position of China. So amazingly, China is becoming the key player for the whole Caspian region these days.
Okay, let's turn. Thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions from Steve Benson concerning China. Let me read these. Western Pacific tensions rising significantly, a dust up, in quotes, with China will likely put maritime hydrocarbon transport in risk. What pressure will then fall on Central Asian sources to fill the gap? And following from that, yesterday, China's recent military exercises surrounding Taiwan, quote unquote, looked like a rehearsal for an invasion. A U.S. Indo-Pacific commander, Samuel Papero, told Nikkei on Wednesday. And this is kind of following along the comments that you made earlier, Tatiana, that of a geopolitical earthquake, so to speak, would have a dramatic impact. Any further thoughts on those types of scenarios?
I think I already referenced that China's dependence on maritime imports of oil and gas, but also of imports of other raw materials and exports of goods. through the South China Sea is paramount is a core Chinese interest. That's what all those island building exercises for decades now is all about. China's uncomfortable with American military dominance of the Western Pacific. And so they will try to do everything they can to protect themselves, which is why they had in the past been willing to entertain Russian and Central Asian pipeline projects. But remember, these projects take a long time to develop. I mean, I've worked on the pipeline projects for 5-7 years before they are completed, and that's a successful project. I've worked on even more pipeline projects that never broke ground. So this is not an instant cure of any sort. I completely disagree with the Indo-PACOM commander that the exercises was a dress rehearsal for invasion. The exercises were a dress rehearsal for an embargo, a maritime embargo, as well as aerial embargo, a blockade of Taiwan rather than a land invasion. And you have to understand what has gone on in Taiwan in the last couple of weeks before the inauguration of the new Taiwan president, and since then with the tension between parliament and the presidency to understand everything that's going on. But I don't agree that China is preparing to invade Taiwan anytime soon, unless it's provoked by into doing so, like a Taiwan Declaration of Independence.
Okay, thanks. As Steve Benson adds to his comment, blockade is an act of war.
Well, that's true, but the Chinese are worried about a U.S. blockade, naval blockade as well, which I told the Chinese, years ago. That's a silly worry because a blockade is an act of war. But the question is, if China is to go to war over Taiwan, there has to be an immediate casus belli, and I don't know what that is unless that they are provoked to do so.
Yes, I very much agree with you. I think it would be a lunatic move on China's part, but
and there's no reason to do it.
Lunatic moves made by governments.
Americans don't seem to understand that Taiwan's largest trading partner is mainland China.
Well, I think there are a lot of things that the American political elite chooses not to understand for reasons. Let me put a couple of other questions, comments on the table. We have an anonymous attendee. I didn't know we could do that, but thank you for organizing the event. How have Russian and Central Asian oil and gas and transit relationships changed since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? And what are its future prospects, keeping in mind how Tatiana Mitrova has cautioned about writing off projects that may not seem as profitable or attractive at first glance? We'll also maybe kind of throw in there that Vladimir Putin was just in Uzbekistan, and was that a big nothing burger, Tatiana, from the standpoint of hydrocarbons? And let me put the next question on the table from my boss, Paul Saunders. Hello, all. Some in Russia have discussed an aspirational north-south transit corridor to India. We've referred to that, but Paul adds, this could, in theory, deliver substantial coal. Thoughts? That would require the building of a serious railroad. I think, but I will leave it to my much more knowledgeable colleagues to address that. Why don't we start with you, Tatiana, and then maybe turn to.
With pleasure. Okay, on the North-South corridor and coal, I'm quite skeptical given the cost of transportation, the price of coal, and the abundance of domestic coal production in India. So I wouldn't bet on coal specifically, too low margin for this whole investment. But on the question regarding Russia's ties with Central Asia since 2022, I've actually wrote a special paper on all these developments because initially Central Asian countries, they've taken very cautious position. Actually, several of them were condemning the invasion, but the others kept silent. All of them trying to distance. In 2022, they were trying very clearly to distance from Russia, and I assume they were also frightened by the Russian influence in the region, Kazakhstan specifically, talking about northern Kazakh territories. But in 2023, this dynamic has changed. And I assume that there were a lot of efforts from Russian side, from commercial and diplomatic circles. And Russia was trying to engage back and to return into its circle, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, proposing something that these countries need badly. They need hydrocarbon supplies for their domestic markets. Russia signed contracts for coal-fired power plants construction in Kazakhstan, for refineries modernization in Turkmenistan, for upstream investments in Uzbekistan. So Russian business, or maybe state-owned corporations, they are expanding their presence in Central Asia, even compared to the pre-war period. And moreover, these severe gas and petroleum products deficits that Central Asian countries have experienced during the past 2 winters, these were national crises, to be clear. Yeah, these massive blackouts. Yeah, and the whole city is freezing in the middle of the winter. It is something really problematic. So Russia is like coming to the rescue with its hydrocarbons. And last year, Russia made a contract with Uzbekistan and started to supply gas. So actually, Putin's visit this week, it was about general discussion about cooperation and reaffirming commitment to keep gas supplies. That was probably the most important commercial part of the discussion. They are also looking at the further expansion of these supplies, both to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but also discussing transit to China. And this is something very interesting because it's a competing project for Power of Siberia too. It's like a lighter version for 15 to 20 BCM, which could go from Yamal, yeah, through Kazakhstan, and then through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and then to China. So I think it's a backup plan if Power of Siberia doesn't advance. There is also very intense cooperation in nuclear. So Putin's visit to Uzbekistan, they have already signed before a nuclear power plant project. And again, they reaffirm their commitment and all the investments. So all in all, I would say that while China and Middle East are providing finance for Central Asian countries, yeah, nobody can beat them in this. And Europe is providing technologies for green transition, though with much more limited financial backup. Russia is providing its unique value proposition are cheap hydrocarbons, which are sold at the price set inside Eurasian Economic Union, which is very low price. Yeah, and it is extremely appealing. The temptation is so strong that the countries cannot stand it. So the influence is increasing.
Thanks, Tatiana. I want to put one comment on the table, and then turn to in reverse order, Greg, then Ed, then you to make any final comments that you would like. On the coal story, the question, it reminded me, of course, that the new Minister of Energy is Sergei Sivalyov. And Sergei Sivalyov, his wife is Anna Putina Sivalyova, the first cousin once removed of Vladimir Putin, which is only in the last year or so that has become more widely known. Chris Munday and I wrote in late December a lengthy piece about her. It's an interesting story of a meteoric rise as a figure of interest. But when Sergei Sivalyov was, and of course they jointly own, thanks to the beneficence of Mr. Timchenko, I think about 12, 13 years ago, the coal company Kolmar. And when Sergei Sivalyov himself was named governor in 2017, then he signed over his shares to his wife, Anna Putina. They've received massive subsidies and tax breaks. And it's been reported a couple of years ago that she's now worth $2.5 billion. But the point here is that their main business is shipping coal to China. And there seems to be quite a bit of infrastructure being built around that that may be part to explain the upgrade modernization of the Baikal-Amur mainline, et cetera, et cetera. But it strikes me that the more likely target for more coal, if it would be going east. Any rate, with that, let me turn final comments to the floor. First, Greg, then Ed, and then Tatiana.
I'll be very brief. Just one other comment on coal to India. Coal mining in India is very labor intensive, and the workers in that industry are an important political constituency. So that's another reason why imports wouldn't be seen. The political importance of the coal unions there. But the other thing that comes into play is India is seeing, alongside hydrocarbons, a big rollout of renewables. If you fly over Mumbai these days, there's solar on all the rooftops, and that's starting to, it's not as big as it is elsewhere, but that is starting to really have an impact there.
Thanks, Greg. Ed?
First of all, let me respond maybe a little bit to Rich Kosarich's question on the middle corridor in the Q&A. As I think I implied earlier, seems to me the middle corridor makes sense with China. It makes little sense without China. I think for China, it's a diversification of export routes, because so much of the export routes to Europe depended in the past on access to Russia. And that's become more problematic for obvious reasons. So the more supply and export routes there are from a Chinese point of view, the better. So I think it would be of interest if China is involved rather than out of the game. The question on financing of infrastructure, which we have already agreed is difficult. You had a very interesting session with Greg last month on Middle East interests in Central Asia. And the question is whether, one possible question is whether Middle Eastern investors who have lots of petrodollars right now to recycle would be interested in looking at infrastructure investment that serves Central Asia or not. Last point on stranded oil and gas assets that we talked about in Central Asia. Primarily, we're talking about yet to be developed or not fully developed oil and gas assets. I think the biggest country in the region that might have oil and gas assets stranded, if the energy transition is real, is Russia. Because it has lost so much of its natural market and has to send its oil and gas a long distance to market right now. So it's become less and less economic. The oil and gas that will remain to be produced even during energy transition will be low-cost production, low-carbon production, near demand centers, preferably short-cycle production like shale oil would be useful. And none of that describes either Central Asia or Russian oil and gas production.
Thanks, Ed. And final word to you, Tatiana.
Well, Andy, I think it was a fascinating discussion. So I've already made all my comments. I just want to thank you for organizing it and bringing us all together. Thanks.
Well, that leads me to want to thank the three of you for leading this terrific discussion. And I especially also want to add my thanks to Jordan Henry, the administrator here at the center that makes everything happen, from us getting paid to putting on online events and in live events, et cetera. So thank you again, Jordan, for your tremendous work. We are going to have a break. I've been holding these on a monthly basis, but I think we're going to take a little break in June, because on June 11th, I am going to get a new hip. It'll take a little bit of time to recover from that. But I promise you that when I do return, I will be more hip than ever. I couldn't resist that one. All right. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening. Bye-bye.